Our next speaker is Angie Thurston, and she is the current Director of Formation at the On Being Impact Lab. Angie is one of the authors of the How We Gather report alongside Casper ter Kuile, and she's done a lot of really deep thinking in this space. During this conversation, we talk about the Formation Project, which is the current ongoing experiment through On Being about what is it like to do spiritual formation outside of traditional religious institutions. This interview was a real joy to do, and I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I did participating in it. Without further ado, Angie Thurston.
Angie, thank you so much for hopping on the call and being a part of the Gathering Summit.
For having me, Casey. It's a treat.
Yeah. I think you and Casper are some of the biggest, maybe well-known people in this space, writing and thinking about kind of the blurring of the lines between the secular and the spiritual, and how spiritual traditions are maybe adapting themselves to the modern age, and how secular communities are maybe becoming more meaningful in people's lives. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how We Gather is now. What are you up to now? And after the success of all these reports.
Sure thing. Yeah. So it's been quite a journey. If you imagine the two of us as second-year divinity students writing this little 24-page report and deciding to get it designed, we definitely at that time were really just trying to mirror back what we were hearing from a landscape of innovative community leaders that we were inspired by, and noticing, oh wow, they're really sharing and seem to be aspiring to do similar things, right? There's some real thematic overlap amongst the work that these folks are doing. So to get from there to that experience having been so catalytic for our careers and for bringing us into a relationship with so many people has been really extraordinary. So at this point, where that's led us is a few things. I think the first has been this amazing dynamic between some of the riches of our wisdom traditions across time and place, coming into conversation with this amazing landscape that's emerging. And so to make that more concrete, we've found that a great deal of our work, somewhat to our own surprise, has ended up being a kind of bridge building role between leaders of religious institutions, as well as, elders, whether they be this amazing group of Catholic sisters that I know Katie Gordon spoke about, or some of the elders that have been working with us on something called the Formation Project, a pilot that I'll talk about. So really translating ancient wisdom to then being in conversation with community leaders who are trying to work in sectors as diverse as fitness to health to education to tech, and trying to see how does the concept of eldering apply in these spaces? How does the concept of small groups apply here? What can we learn about the process of discovering what it feels like to truly belong? And within that feeling of belonging, cultivate a sense of growth toward the unique person that each one of us feels called to be. All of that, there's so much to be said about that in the traditions that have been handed down to us, but for various reasons, the wisdom in those traditions can be locked up and feel inaccessible to folks. So I think that's been a big theme of where our work has led us at this point. And it's taking shape in a few areas. One of them is that ongoing thought leadership, the naming and framing of what's emerging has been and continues to be a piece. The second is around prototyping. So this pilot, the Formation Project, and other experiments of how do we actually do that? And then more and more, we're also partnering and collaborating with existing organizations. It's a little bit of a consulting type of thing, right? Where we're in partnership trying to help do that translation into the projects that people are exploring.
Cool. Very cool. I want to dive into the Formation Project stuff, but maybe Real quick, the thing you just mentioned. So the consulting, is that tends to be more on the kind of secular side, where communities are looking to bring more of the kind of depth into what they're doing, or is that more in kind of like the traditional institutions who are looking to find out ways to reach more people, or all of the above?
Yeah, well, it is both. And this is a nascent part of our work. So I definitely couldn't, it would be premature to categorize it in any sort of strict way. But we've just noticed, I guess it actually came out of more of the religious space. When we wrote How We Gather, we expected to be in conversation with the folks in that so-called secular landscape who were really serving especially millennial audiences who were not necessarily affiliated religiously. But the biggest response to How We Gather came from leaders of religious institutions, because the question on their lips was, where are all the millennials? And we were basically saying, here they are, and
Right.
so
They're at SoulCycle.
yeah, totally. So it's actually been just a huge gift for us to end up getting to know a lot of these really just really creative and forward-thinking leaders within religious institutions who are asking big and hard questions about the future of their organization. So that has been and continues to be a piece of it. But then there's also this important piece around, how does a tech company think about these themes like personal transformation and social change and activating creativity and purpose finding and things of that nature that our religious traditions have a lot to say about. So it's both.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, I know David White talks a lot about that, right? The kind of how that sounds like very much his stuff around bringing creativity and soul into work. But
Yeah, for sure.
maybe you could talk a little bit more about what the Formation Project is for people who aren't yet familiar with it, haven't yet heard of it.
Sure. Well, so this word formation, has been one that is an example of a term that, at least in certain meanings of the word, has been sort of housed within specifically the tradition of Christianity writ large, and this idea of essentially how do we become who we feel called to be, the movement in a direction of spiritual deepening or spiritual maturation. And so we've been working with that concept, and this is not even a joke, in part thanks to Beyonce and the fact that formation as a word has become so steeped in the popular imagination. It's been a kind of concept we've been able to dig into. And the impetus for it came from a couple of places. One was that as we got to know and work with leaders of innovative communities around the country, one thing that emerged as a common theme was that folks would often end up creating an organization or stepping into leadership of an organization based on a need that they themselves felt. So something like the dinner party, Lennon Flowers and her collaborators on that project, they had all lost a loved one who was close to them, and they were searching for some kind of forum where they could just come together and be human together in the midst of that loss as young people, right? And so the dinner party, which is now a global organization, at the time was just an attempt to serve a need that they themselves were feeling acutely. And so what happens with someone like Lennon and many others of these leaders is, over the course of time, they end up being a little bit set apart because they end up serving the needs of the community. And so little by little, they can end up in a role that really is very similar to the role of a minister or a pastor or a leader of a traditional religious community, in which people are bringing their whole lives to this place and then expecting the leader to be there in a kind of caring role, right, as well as the more administrative leadership role. And so this was happening over and over again, whether someone was running a makerspace or a SoulCycle studio or a justice movement or a gaming community, right? And so there was this fascinating phenomenon of, like, people are holding their Shivas in the CrossFit box. They're asking their SoulCycle instructors to perform their weddings. They're going to the makerspace at 3 a.m. to do welding instead of self-harming, right? There's like very serious highs and lows that are being brought to these communities. And so what we found amongst these leaders was a real yearning to figure out, how do I deepen my own well so that I can go deep with the people in my care? And so it was out of that that hunger amongst the leaders that we started to wonder, especially given that our team was in the context of a divinity school, which is traditionally where ministers go to learn how to do that work. We wondered, how might we start helping to translate some of that ancient wisdom about this work into a context where people are already doing the work. So the Formation Project came out of that question, as well as the question of, for the many, many who are unaffiliated or cobbling together a spiritual life, how do we go deeper? And this is something that applies to me. So I've certainly yearned for this myself. So the Formation Project is attempting to create a container for deepening for folks who are across and beyond religious traditions and who are all over the world. So those are the two design challenges of this pilot, is how do you create a container where people can live lives where they move into greater meaning and greater purpose and greater belonging, but without relying on shared religious language or shared language at all, or shared religious practice or shared practice at all. So we've really built it around these three principles of how do you cultivate that which is deepest within yourself, so the inner life. How do you speak to and live in relationship to people from that deepest place in the outer life? And then how does that interplay of inner and outer help to foster a sense of purpose, or a sense of what am I for? So it's that inner, outer, and then the greater thing of which we're part. Those are the three dimensions or pillars of this pilot. So we're just at the beginning. We launched in October of 2018. And it's at this point 40 participants and a group of facilitators who are holding space for weekly small groups. And they meet online. And we're going to see what happens. It's basically, it's in beta.
Cool. That's an exciting place to be. So it sounds like the HDS experience really kind of informed, in some ways, how you're thinking about spiritual formation generally in this particular project. Could you talk a little bit about what from HDS you kind of are bringing into this new attempt at spiritual formation, and maybe also what new things you're bringing in, and maybe what you're maybe letting stay in the more traditional formation experience?
Yeah, sure. Well, just to give a couple concrete examples, our first 2 or 3 small group meetings were dedicated to the process of sharing spiritual autobiographies. So this was actually the thing that introduced me to Casper, with whom I've done so much of this work. Was we had our Introduction to Ministry Studies class in 2013, I think. In which that was the first thing we did, was to share our spiritual autobiographies, which is just, in this case, 20 minutes of how would I tell the story of my life through the lens of that which has been of greatest meaning and value. And that might be a story that includes any religious upbringing I did or didn't have, as well as my sense of the sacred or lack thereof in my life, right? So it's through that lens. And that's something that in my work I've gotten to do with, at this point, hundreds of people, which is like my favorite thing, because I'm the biggest spiritual nerd that I have met. So, but that's been an example of something that I wouldn't have known that language or had that experience if not for my education at HDS.
Yeah.
And another thing is, because these groups of people are comprised of folks who come from all different backgrounds, right? Who use some use the language of spiritual to describe themselves. Some use the word Christian, some use the word Jewish, some use the word Hindu, some use the word atheist, some use the word agnostic, some use the word Muslim, so, and bunches of those words and other words put together, right? So we can't rely upon having the same language. And, in contexts like that, it's always probable, I would say, that at some point along the line, we will step on each other's toes, or worse, in the process of trying to be together. So that's another thing that I really learned from my time at HDS as a student, was how to engage from a space of openness, in willingness to express my own truth in my own language, as well as to listen for wisdom that's beyond my experience. So some of the invitations that we're issuing the participants around being in that kind of multi-religious space, and being willing to step forward and be authentic to one's own experience, and also open to the experience of others, right? That whole thing, which I think is pretty applicable to our world as it stands, has been a big gift of the Divinity School experience. But to be honest, in terms of things that we're letting go, like what we're doing with the Formation Project is not something that I experienced, at least in its fullness, in my Divinity School education. And I wish that I had, and I wish that more people could have experiences that help them get in touch with that which is most meaningful to them and which brings them greatest joy and which allows them to flourish in terms of a sense of purpose, whether or not they are interested in ministry, So I think there is a dream involved in this project and some of our aspirations for what it might become that has to do with kind of translating out of the so-called ivory tower some of those riches, right? So that they're not kind of bound up in a place that is also oriented around a certain vocational call toward ministry or oriented around, the whole intense graduate school education that gets layered on top, right? But to sort of free that and invite it to be something people can bring into their own lives and into their family life and into their work life and into their finances and into the, just to make it more holistic and present to the everyday.
For sure. Very cool. Maybe could you talk a little bit more about the specific things you're doing around creating that multi-religious space? Because I think that's something that we're definitely thinking a lot about as well, even for this kind of summit, because we definitely have speakers from across the religious spectrum. We've got participants from across the spiritual secular spectrum. And I wonder if there's any kind of, thoughts you might have on, for individuals coming into a space that might be both, that aims to be both welcoming and maybe in some ways challenging in a way, in terms of putting out, worldviews that one might not be as familiar with. Yeah. And for us as organizers, things we can do to help create better space.
Right. Well, who knows what we've done well and what we've not done well, of course. Right? There's definitely learning at every stage, but some of the things that I have experienced to be fruitful in our gatherings, especially in-person gatherings. So this predates the Formation Project, but certainly informs it. When we started gathering folks in this space in 2015, that was the sort of how we gather contingent. We brought together 50 leaders who were kind of representative of that population we were speaking and writing about in How We Gather. And then a year later, we brought together 80 leaders who were both the leaders in so-called secular spaces, right, as far as the fitness communities and the arts communities, as well as innovators in religious spaces. So the dinner churches and the online Buddhist sanghas and the Muslim small groups and the pop-up Shabbats, right? So that kind of landscape, we were asking ourselves, what will that be like to have leaders who are leading secular communities and leaders leading religious communities all together working toward the same questions. And what we found was that it was within about 3 hours, you couldn't tell who was who in the sense that there was a real kinship that was evident amongst the leaders, where they felt they were engaged in similar work. And so some of the things that we did in that shared space, every morning we had spiritual practices that the participants led each other in. And so, and that was, so we had there's a couple, Lauren Grogan and Michael Plank, who lead a Presbyterian church and a CrossFit box. And so they did CrossFit Bible study upstairs. And then downstairs you had Muslim prayer. And then you had, something that would be about poetry and movement, and something else that would be about, Jewish text study, right? So we tried to kind of create space for a multiplicity of practice, but we were very, and this has been true at our gatherings since, we were very insistent that this was a core dimension of the experience, so not something to sleep through, right? But so that I found to be powerful, and I think people did as well. And we also had event chaplains at all of our events. So somebody who was present, who was specifically there to be able to speak confidentially with participants about their experience, especially in a spiritual realm. And we found that to be important as well. We've also had caucus spaces, specifically caucus spaces around race. And so opportunities daily for white participants and participants of color to gather optionally, but as a space to kind of process and share what their experience has been along those lines as well, which I think has been important. And we've really become committed to some kind of container creation at the outset, whether it's in a gathering or in these small groups of the formation project, that has to do with committing to the way we're going to show up together. So sometimes we've used and adapted the touchstones from the Center of Courage and Renewal.
Yep.
Jen Bailey and Mickey Scott Bay Jones at the Faith Matters Network have created a beautiful piece around brave space. That is something we've used more recently. And again, it's been something that the group co-creates, right? But something to start with that allows people to enter into and amend and adapt throughout the time they're together. And now for the formation project, we're relying heavily on covenant. And so every week, there's 9 months of small groups meeting online for 90 minutes. And I actually have my group meeting right after this call. And we spent 15 minutes of those 90 on our covenant, which is a set of aspirational commitments that we've made to each other. And we start out with a template. And then actually at today's meeting, we're going to be adapting that template based on the reality of our particular group and our dynamic and what language feels right to us. But we revisit that covenant for 15 minutes every week as a way of reminding ourselves of how we've committed to showing up, and also with the clear knowledge that we will fall short and we'll make mistakes and we'll hurt each other, and that this provides us a space in which to have explicit permission and invitation to take a look at how we're living into the way that we aspire to be together. So that's been really, really powerful for us as well.
Cool. Those are all super helpful, and definitely sparking lots of ideas for things maybe we should try and do as well during the summit. Like I love particularly the idea of having lots of different kind of spiritual practices people can tap into from across traditions. Because I think one thing that in speaking with some people who maybe don't identify within a particular tradition, there's like a desire to tap into and experience some of these things, but also, in a space where they're not feeling like there's a kind of conversion that's being attempted. Yeah. And so being in such like a pluralistic environment where it's kind of like experience the tradition, but we're not trying to hard sell you. I think could be really meaningful for a lot of people.
Yeah. And it is, I think there's a lot that I've learned about the framing around something like that of, at Harvard Divinity School, they had a noon service every week for years. And this divinity school, like most, was derived from a Protestant origin. And so this noon service was Christian and Protestant. And then over the years, as the student body became more diverse, they were trying to water it down and make it more and more inclusive. But the result is that it became less and less appealing to anyone, including the Protestants, right? So it was like nobody was going. So They flipped it on its head and instead said, this noon service is going to be all in on whatever people are. And so it became like full immersion Baptists and, the 2 different kinds of Catholic services. But then also, the Muslim service, 2 different kinds of Muslim services and Buddhist services and Hindu services. And I was part of a student group that I co-founded called the HDS Religious Nuns, NONES. And so then we started doing noon services, et cetera. So, but the framing around those was always something that we would recite as a litany that had to do with showing up in a space of openness and participating as much or as little as we felt comfortable, with a preference toward leaning into it, of course, but that the responsibility fell to each person to modulate their involvement to the extent that they felt comfortable. And I think especially based on what you're saying, there is a lot of strong and legitimate response that people can feel in those kinds of settings based on their own experience, some of which may have been really, really difficult, right? And may have felt coercive in some way. So making it available and making the extent of participation optional, but also issuing that real invitation that this is a space where we want to we want to benefit from each other's experience and from discovering what has been of value to each person there in the room.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting that you bring that up, because I think I spoke a little bit with Casper about the sense that a lot of the people who are seeming to have success adapting kind of religious traditions to the modern age. Like a lot of these groups are kind of firmly rooted in the tradition, right? So the kind of like Hillsong, the kind of like millennial skin church in New York and Oliver, or like Lab Shul, which is in New York, which is trying to adapt maybe Jewish traditions for a modern age. And there's been, I think, a little bit less of like kind of interfaith across faith. Like someone who's taking little bits of everything and trying to bring that to the forefront. And I know, so I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on that. And I know you also, I read one of your pieces on visiting, I think, the UU General Assembly. And so I don't know if that taps into it a little bit as well.
That was like 4 years ago. Yeah. Sorry, what did you say about that?
So yeah, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, with like the religiously unaffiliated, do you think, and with these adaptations to try and reach more people, how do you think about this balance of being rooted within tradition versus people trying to do things across traditions, and where do you see things going?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that has been one thing that I've learned about some of what's happening is I think for many, there is a barrier that can come into play when the threshold to belonging is belief, a specific creed of belief that a community is predicated upon. And that's often misconstrued, where the phenomenon of disaffiliation, or of people who name themselves as spiritual but not religious, is presumed to mean that they are atheists or agnostic, which in some cases is true, but the vast majority of cases is incomplete as an assessment, that really there's often a lot going on with people that they would identify as spiritual, or whatever language they might use to describe this sense of being part of something greater, but that it doesn't fit within the containers that are on offer, right? So part of what happens there is that for the communities that name themselves to be in a secular landscape, and we can just use SoulCycle since that's such a juicy one, you have people, and I've had the great gift of getting to interview lots of them, you have participants in SoulCycle who go into that space, some of them, literally on the bikes next to each other. One person's working off the cheesecake from the night before. One person during the Hill Ballad is literally praying to Jesus. One person is using this as their meditation, right? Their space where they can just be attentive and mindful in the presence of others. And another person is, reflecting on, like listening to the instructor, who of course is saying something like, "Who are you riding for?" And they're reflecting on their relationships. And they're like, I'm really going to show up differently for my kids today than I did yesterday, that kind of thing, right? So you have all that going on. So, if you think about the organization of a religious community as being often, at least in a Judeo-Christian frame, as around orthodoxy, which is right belief. A lot of these communities instead are organized around orthopraxy, which is a right or shared practice, right? So something like SoulCycle, you are there because you're all doing the same thing, even though some of what works about it is that you can modulate your own experience based on your capacity or your interest in just how high you want that resistance knob, right? But that within that, you can be believing all different things, but you can actually bring those beliefs into the space, at least in a personal way. So I think that's been one trend that we've noticed, and that's even often true in spaces that name themselves as religious. So something like House for All Sinners and Saints, founded by Nadia Boltz-Weber, in Denver, some of the language just right there front and center on that website is that Nadia's Lutheran enough for all of us, right? So that the actual congregation, in her case, is from all walks of life and all stripes of belief. And that's not an expectation, even though the community itself has actually a very traditional liturgy. And I think that's true for something like Lab Shul as well. It's like, you're going to get something deep and specific in this place, but there's not an expectation that you identify with it in any way that feels beyond your own threshold based on your experience and your own sense of what's true. So I think that's a really important trend, I guess, that I see continuing. And it's, I guess we're to some extent taking it a step further with the Formation Project in saying that the orthopraxy, or the practice that is shared in this container, has to do with making a commitment to show up for this small group, for instance, right? And making a commitment to practice, and that the practice moves along this arc from inner life to outer life to life together, but that the actual practices that one might choose to cultivate the inner life are going to vary completely from person to person. I think the first thing we had participants do upon entering the project was to name what was on their line. So we basically said that formation is the cultivation of disciplines with the intention of drawing nearer to blank. And this blank was essentially the deepest sense of that which calls you. So for some people, that was God. For some, it's Buddha nature. For some, it's higher self. For some, it's primordial awareness. For some, it's justice. For some, it's Christ consciousness, right? So there's a different set of language, and some folks are very much still unclear on what words they would put there, but they're working with it, right? So the practices that one might choose are to draw nearer to that. So how do I draw nearer to the sacred in myself, right? What practices do I choose? But we're not expecting a consistency of practice, or there's no desire built into the project that the participants are going to come out the other side using the same words, or like meditating at the same time, or doing anything like that. It's a kind of, and again, it's an experiment. We'll see whether we can achieve cohesion in that sense of unity of purpose without uniformity of belief or practice. So that's the big question mark there at the heart of it.
Cool. I mean, but it does sound like there is a uniformity of practice and just the small group experience, right? Committing to, kind of reflect on your spiritual growth for 90 minutes a week, and to, outside of that time, deepen spiritually, whatever that means, is in and of itself I think it's not something that everyone does, right?
No, it is not. And yeah, I will say that the participants in this beta experience are very, I think they are people who have evinced a desire. That was the number one. There was no application. It was just that you had to desire this so much that you were willing to disrupt life as you know it to engage in this, just as you're saying. So yeah, it is a special group who are like, I'm ready to go all in on that thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so it sounds like you're actually not, so I was going to ask about common language that you all are discovering. It sounds like maybe that's not the direction you're going. You're kind of wanting people to continue to use the language that really resonates most with them. But I'm wondering if you all internally have come to think of some kind of maybe on like a higher level of abstraction, like where you just mentioned kind of like Buddha consciousness, Buddha nature, Christ consciousness, primordial awareness. Is there something, are you all thinking about kind of patterns of language to talk about like that thing in whatever way it's being described? Or is there a sense that it's different depending on how it's described? Or?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think what I feel the most convicted about is that this moment is a call to creativity, that a lot of the language we inherited, along with the structures we inherited, do not feel fit for purpose, and that if anything, they are alienating instead of heart opening. I had the gift of going to a retreat with Father Richard Rohr, who's a Catholic Jesuit priest that has become well known to many, but he was leading us through the Lord's Prayer. And, that word Father to describe God is a big stumbling block for a lot of folks, right? So before he even began it, he said, we're about to do this, but what I want you to do is when you get to that part, I'm going to say, Father, I invite you to say the word that opens your heart. So he invited, and where it says all powerful, he was like, you might say all vulnerable. What does that do to your sense of the divine, right? So I think what I hope for is that with something like what's on your line and these various invitations, that there's at least a way in which we can invite the creativity of the individual into this particular space, which is not to say we're all going to arrive at the same place. At least for me, that's not a goal, but I do hope that individuals can find usable language that allows them to make the progress they want to make. I think that's some of the conundrum, is when this entire realm of experience is rendered invisible by the categories we have, right? If it's like, oh, well, if I don't fit in any of these boxes, then this just isn't my experience, right? It's like negated by the lack of language to describe it. So my hope is at least to enrich the possibility and sense of permission within individuals to just explore this dimension of their lives, to the extent that they're interested in that, because I think that's where the barrier comes into play, where we can end up throwing things out just by virtue of not being able to talk about them and therefore not sensing they're legitimate.
Right.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I think especially for people who maybe have like left a tradition or, grown up without a tradition, finding ways to tap into that, like, primordial awareness or sense of meaning, like these bigger questions that make a life, in language that resonates, I think is
Totally. Yeah. One of the, again, experimental features of the Formation Project is a well of resources that we've called around healing, around self-awareness, and then around the inner, outer, beyond, all those 5 categories. And we've been helped by the folks at Spirituality and Practice who have basically been amassing resources around these things for many years.
Wow.
But in that process, I think one of my hopes is, because this is kind of a daunting place to be, I think, especially if you've either left a tradition or you just weren't raised with one, right? Which is the case for more and more people. So part of what we're trying to do is to offer, like, it's okay if you have no idea what you would put on that line, and if you have no idea where to start in cultivating the inner life, right? But to at least present, like, here are hundreds of practices and books and podcasts and, a sort of curated list for starters of places you might turn. Because I think that's part of where it can just feel really intimidating, is like, well, I'm not going to just go walk into that, synagogue on the corner for XYZ reasons. But I am curious about Sabbath, or I'm curious about, what it means to live an ethical life, right? So like, how do you get in that door when the threshold of the whole thing put together can feel daunting? So that's part of the hope as well, is to make that available to explore.
Cool. Very cool. And maybe my one last question before we kind of go into like a wrap up. Do you think so one of the things that I've experienced when I've talked with some people about this kind of topic is a concern about what happens when kind of secular and in particular for-profit communities become the place where people are finding meaning. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and kind of like the potential risks, or how people are managing that risk and doing it well.
Totally. Yeah, it's such a juicy topic. Yeah. I think for starters, it's worth saying that at least in the United States, any notion that religious community has been independent of profit is not really true. So a lot of times there will be like a pointing toward, especially the fitness communities, which are based on what is culturally current right now that people are willing to pay for, right? Which is a hot body. Maybe health, but really it's the body, right? So you can make money off of those in a way that a lot of the communities around the arts or grief and loss or justice just don't have that kind of currency to get rich off of
the business model.
Right? Yeah, right. It's just different in the way our culture values things, which that's its own story, right? But but people have been paying for pews for generations, right? So there's definitely more to that story, just first of all, in terms of, it's not as stark as it may seem. That being said, I think there is a lot of important nuance to the phenomenon of things like wellness and mindfulness and community being desired and to some extent embraced within organizational life, and especially corporate culture, where, especially generationally, millennials and Gen Z are more and more asking their workplace to be a place of meaning and belonging and purpose, right? And so to some extent, there's and I think, by the way, that is connected to the crisis of isolation that we have, which is itself connected to some of these trends around disaffiliation, where people just don't have a robust sense of community necessarily anywhere else in their life. And so their workplace starts to be the locus of that. Like, oh, I should be getting that at work. And some of that can be beautiful, right? But it's also just challenging in certain other respects, especially if the ultimate bottom line of the company is the dollar bill. And if some of these practices like, like mindfulness practices, for instance, are applied toward the ends of reducing stress and upping employee productivity, which ultimately is about the bottom line, right? That kind of dynamic can be fraught, to put it mildly. And so to me, the question is like, what is a faithful way in which organizations can show up in response to this need that is not ultimately coercive? And I think a lot of us can really detect when it feels that way, whether it's a religious organization that's basically saying like, come hither, and we're like, or if it's a corporation that's saying like, come do this mindfulness process and, increase your productivity. They both, you can feel what's underneath that pretty easily a lot of the time. So it's an area that we're actively exploring in, and just trying to both innovate in and foster innovation in that particular question and space. I think one of the more out there ideas we've had is to think about like in the way that organizations take responsibility for their employees' healthcare, but they don't themselves provide the healthcare.
Right.
What might it look like for organizations to step up and take some responsibility for their employees' well-being, but not be the providers of that well-being, so that it becomes like I think it's when those things become married to each other that it can start to get icky.
Right.
But if it were to be somehow like that, one of the virtues provided by your organization was that they would connect you to, whether it's time or money or even availability of specific resources in a local community or beyond, that would contribute to your sense of living a meaningful life or becoming the person you're called to be or having a sense of greater purpose. I will say it's risky for the organization, because sometimes when people find a sense of deeper purpose, they quit their job.
Right. It's better.
Yeah, exactly. But, I think it would require a certain maturity of the leadership to be willing to take that on based on the benefit that it would actually have to the individual and I think to society. If people were really thriving in that way, I think it would ultimately be in service of the better case scenario than our current status quo.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Angie, I really appreciate your time. 2 quick questions just to end. The first is, if people want to find you and your work online, where should they look to kind of continue to follow along?
Yeah, for sure. The easiest place is just howwegather.org. For now. You can also take a look at the On Being project, where a lot of our work is housed. And you'll see there's a brand new digital platform at On Being and a lot of amazing resources for everything from social healing to cultivating the inner and outer life. So that's another good spot to check out.
Okay, cool. And then the last question, is there any book that you find yourself recommending to people the most or giving to people the most in and around this topic?
Oh, yeah. One of my favorites right now is called Descent into Love.
Okay.
It's by Killian No, who's the founder of Recovery Cafe in Seattle. Killian is one of our 2 elder facilitators for the Formation Project and a gem of a human being.
Cool.
So that's one that's really been inspiring in a practical and just sort of heart-filling way.
Cool. Very cool. I'll be adding it to my list to read next.
Nice.
All right, cool. Well, Angie, thank you so much for taking the time. I want to leave you time to kind of prep for your small group, but really appreciate the conversation and feel like could chat all day about this stuff. So
yeah, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate it too. Thanks, Casey, and I hope it's a great conference.